So here we are again to talk about some Latin grammar. I'm actually going to start talking about just infinitives and looking at the forms, because looking a little bit at what y'all were talking about in class, it doesn't seem like you met an awful lot of infinitive forms last year. So we're just going to go through this time and talk specifically forms, look at first conjugation verbs, how you form all their infinitives, second conjugation verbs, all of their infinitives, third ios, fourths, and a few irregular verbs. We're also going to look at deponent versions of all of these, which means we won't have all the infinitives. So the first thing to look at is the fact that what even is an infinitive. So an infinitive is an unconjugated verb. That just means it doesn't have a person or a number, but it can have anything else. It has tense, it has voice, and it's its own mood. So I guess it doesn't have a different one of those. But all this means is we're not going to put an OST, MUS, TISNT, or an aorist term or mini inter ending to it, but we can do other things with it. So when you first met infinitives, you met them as the second principal part. So when you had a verb like amo, amare, you knew that this was your infinitive. And you were probably told that this is your infinitive because it has the RE. Yes, that is all true. But more specifically, it is your present active infinitive. So present, and abbreviate, active infinitive equals your second principal part. And that's great. It's a very, very useful infinitive. You can use it as the subject of a sentence. You know, to love is a grand thing. You can use it to complete an idea. You know, I am able to love my Latin students because they're so smart and so hardworking. And you can use it also in indirect discourse, which we looked at a little bit last time. Like, I know that my parents love me. You know, my parents become the subject of the second sentence. It's within the larger sentence. So when you have a verb like woco, what's its infinitive? It's present active infinitive. You think woco is a first conjugation verb, so it's going to have that same VOC stem and that same RAE ending. And to translate this, of course, you just translate it to whatever the verb means, this time to call. Up here, of course, to love. And that's pretty basic and pretty straightforward. But you can do something else with this, and that is get rid of the active part of it and have a present passive infinitive. Just get rid of all of this. So to have a present passive, actually I'm going to color code and do this one in blue. Have a present passive infinitive. All you do is go to that second principal part, amare, and we are going to subtract the E, which gives us that AMAR. And to that, we're going to add an I, which gives us AMARI. Technically a long I, but the macron will only matter for scanning, and as you've already been told, that macron's going to disappear at some point. So, same thing when we have woco. Our present active infinitive is vocare. So what do we need to take away next? So we're going to take away the E, which gives us wocar. And what do we need to add now? We're going to add that I, which gives us an answer of vocari. So that's the form. It's pretty easy to form. The question now is the translation. Well, since it's an infinitive, it's going to have two at the beginning of it. Since it is passive, we're going to have a form of the verb to be. So to be, whatever the verb means, to be verbed. So to be loved, to be called. I don't like to be called Annie. You know, to be loved is a grand thing. It can be used as a subject, it can be used complimentary, it can be used in indirect discourse. My parents know that I don't like to be called Annie. Though technically it was still complimentary in that sentence. You can do this with any conjugation. So let's go ahead and look at second conjugations, present active versus their present passive. So a second conjugation verb's present active. So if I have video, the infinitive, of course, is videre. Macron is necessary. If I have habeo, second principal part, its present active infinitive is habere, macron, necessary. To translate these, of course, videre is just to see. I am able to see better with my glasses. And habere, of course, is to have and to hold. With to have, what I like to refer to as the marriage vowel verb, to have and to hold. So folks promise to have and to hold each other. When you want to change this to present passive, it's the exact same formula. So we have our videre. We're going to minus or subtract one of the e's. That gives us our videre. And then to that, we're going to add the I, which gives us our videre. Macron, sure, we'll still say it's necessary there. And then, of course, same with habeo. If we switch that to the passive, present passive, we have our habere. We're going to subtract that last e, which gives us haber. And then we're going to add to that an I. And so we're going to get our haberi. Translation again. This is to see, to have. But once we go to the passive, to be seen and to be had or to be held is probably a better way to see that word. One idiomatic use, videre, or any form of video videre in the passive can also be to seem. So North Carolina's motto is esse quam videre, to be rather than to seem. So to be a good, citizen rather than to seem like a good citizen. Really, it's just splitting hairs on whether that's to be seen. So is it better to be a good citizen or just to be seen as a good citizen? So kudos to North Carolina for having that as their motto. Would that Georgia would have a Latin motto that we could end up using. Same thing is going to happen when we look at our fourth conjugation verbs. So when we have our present active, I should not have erased that, just leave that up there. If we have a verb like audeo, our present active infinitive is auderi. And that, of course, is to hear. When we have something like skio, what's his present active infinitive? Its second principal part. Skire. And of course, this is to know. Again, we know it's a present active infinitive because it has that RE, but when we go to our present passive, label this. We have that audire minus the E at the end gives us our audire. To that, we're going to add an I. And that, of course, gives us audiri. And so let's try the same thing for skio. Skire minus what? The E gives us skier. To that, we're going to add our I, and that gives us skieri. So audire with an E is to hear, and skire with an E is to know. Audiri with an I at the end of it is to be heard. So I like to be heard. I'm very self-conscious that I'm heard by my neighbors right now. And skiri, to be known. I don't like to be known as Annie. So I'm sure y'all are smart enough at math to realize which conjugation I skipped. And that's, of course, third, because third does everything weird in Latin. I lie to the Latin 1 children when I tell them that 3 is a magic number, because really it's just an evil number. So when we have a verb, and we're going to use my favorite one, mitto, mittere, to send. Our present active infinitive is just mittere with a short ere right there. And we'll, of course, translate that as to send. So I remembered to send my mother a birthday card earlier this evening. If I have something like pono, what's that second principal part? What's that present active infinitive? So it's ponere with a short ere. And that, of course, just translates as to put or to place. here's where it gets weird. When we go to a present passive infinitive, instead of just going to the second principal part and dropping just the E, we're actually going to drop the ERE entirely. So we just get pone. What was our stem? The reason for this is just because the E is so weak, it just can't even hold on to having the R after it. It's just too few strong letters in a row, and so it just ends up dropping all of it. To this stem of PON, we are going to add our I, and so our passive infinitive for pono, ponere, becomes pony. And so for mitto, mittere, we start with our present active infinitive, mittere. We drop what? Our ERE, and that gives us mit for our stem. And to that, we're going to add the I, and we get mitty. And so while mittere is translated as to send, I remember to send my mom a card, mitty is to be sent. So no student likes to be sent to the principal's office. So pono, ponere, that ponere gets to translate as to put. Pony, the passive infinitive, however, is to be put. No one likes to be put in their place. So those are our present infinitives. We now need to look at our perfect infinitives. And we can have both perfect active and perfect passive infinitives. So we're going to start with perfect active infinitives. What we need now is to make sure that we know our principal parts, because it's going to matter so much with this one. We are going to use our third principal part. So let's go back to first conjugation. We had amo, amare, that's that present active infinitive, and then we had amawi for our third principal part. And that's the one we're going to use. We need to make sure we're using the third principal part for our perfect active infinitive. So we're going to take a stem of amav, because we're dropping the I, and to that we are going to end up adding the letters I, S, S, E. Amawise. It's a fun one to say. I will admit that. I'm not as big on spoken Latin as y'all know, but it is a fun one to pronounce and get to say. To translate this one, you say to have loved. So the to indicates to us in English that this is an infinitive. The have indicates to us that this is perfect tense, and the loved is the definition coming through for us. So to have loved and lost is better than to have never loved at all, in the classic quotation as that goes. So if we have the verb woko wokare, woko wokare, what is that third principal part? Well, it's a first conjugation verb, so since most of those follow the pattern, we know it's just going to be wokawi. So we get that stem, wokav, if I may alter the pronunciation for the sake of clarity here. To that, we're going to add the ISSE. So if woko means to call, our perfect infinitive is then going to be translated as to have called. Now you can do this with any of the conjugations. All that matters is the third principal part. And so for all of them, it's actually much easier to do. You don't have to worry about third conjugation being weird even. So if we have habeo, I should have an O on the end of that. Habeo, habere, habui, and then let's look at mito, mitere, misi, and oh, we should do a third IO. Let's do facio, facere, feci. Long I there. And for a fourth, let's go with aldio, aldire, aldiwi. All that's going to matter for any of these, doesn't matter what conjugation they are, is that we know the third principal part. And so hopefully when you were first learning your Latin 1 and Latin 2 verbs, you were learning all the principal parts together. If not, that's okay. Some students don't start out doing that. One thing that you may want to think about is certain trends. So hopefully you were taught the mnemonic that for the perfect ride around Rome, you need an extra long SUV, because many of our third principal parts will have an S, a U, a V, some long vowel, because actually technically this is fakey, or an X. So if I'd use deco, we would have seen that one, because it goes deco, decoder, dixie, dictum. So that's one way that you can try and recognize a stem once you start seeing weird U's or S's or long marks on it, and definitely the V's. The V's love to stand out. So to all of these, all we'd have to add is that ise to get our perfect infinitive. And so the perfect infinitive is going to matter when we're looking at indirect discourse, because if we're in present tense and our main verb, like I know that I have, had this same song come up on my playlist over and over again, or I know that I have sent cards every birthday or every year for my mom's birthday. It's her birthday next week. My comments on all of this. I have facio here. Like I know that I have made these notes like 500 times for students, and all the other. I know that I've heard this song before, but I can never remember the band or the artist's name. So perfect infinitives are useful in indirect discourse because it helps us go into the past tense when whatever it is that we know or we think or we said happened prior to our main tense action there. One that I want to especially bring up here is the word sum esse, because you can actually do a perfect infinitive for sum esse. I'm just going to hit myself there. So we have our sum, we have our esse, which of course is our present active infinitive, just to be, and then we have that wonderful fui. The classic old Latin shirt of having just the letters FU on the front and on the back, the perfect stem of sum. Highly imperfect. We would never do that. So we have our stem, which ends up just being FU. And to that, just like with any other verb, we're going to add ise. And this is a form that we're actually going to see more frequently than I'd like to admit, and than any student really wants to have to admit in our Latin text. The translation of this is just to have been. And just like any other time that you would see this sort of infinitive, whatever's on one side of it's going to be on the other. So if everything's nominative, you keep everything nominative. If you're in indirect discourse and your subject was in the accusative, then anything that's completing that idea, any adjective that's describing it, or another noun that is being the predicate nominative with it, is actually going to end up being like a predicate accusative with it. So we can add that for this verb. Let us now look at perfect passive. And again, this is where knowing your principal parts really, really matters. So if we go to perfect passive. So when we first met a verb like amo, amare, amawi, we should have also learned our last principal part is amatum. Or maybe you learned amatus. Make that look more like an M. So we always used our first person singular, present active indicative to start us off, because Romans are narcissistic just like we are. I love. Then we've seen our present active infinitive to love. We've seen our perfect stem here with our first person singular, perfect active indicative to have loved, or I have loved there. And that last principal part, of course, is our perfect passive participle. And just like when you learned the perfect passive system of normal conjugated verbs, you used the last principal part, the PPP, plus some form of the verb to be. So if you had amatus est, he has been loved, or he was loved. We're going to use the same one. We're going to use that fourth principal part, amatum. We're going to leave a space. I'm going to underscore here just so we know that I'm leaving a space. We are going to add to that esse. So just like when we were looking at our perfect passive system for normal conjugated verbs, it was the fourth principal part plus the form of the verb to be. Well, for the infinitive, the same logic applies. You take your fourth principal part plus your form of to be, that's the infinitive. So we're getting everything about the definition of the word from the fourth principal part, but we're getting the actual aspect of it as an infinitive from the essay. And to translate this, we get this wonderfully long to have been loved. So in that famous line, to have loved and lost is better than to have never been loved at all. So this is one of the beautiful things about Latin, is how condensed it can be. These two words equal these four in English. AP, we have seen a lot of these sort of forms coming up in our indirect discourse in Caesar thus far, normally with the essay omitted. Roman authors are going to do that fairly frequently. Right now you've got notes and need to tell you that that's what's missing from the sentence. Latin 3, you'll be seeing this more and more, mainly because I'll be contriving some sentences so that you see this more and more. So let's form this with a few others, maybe one from each conjugation. So if we have video, its PPP is visum. And let's then look at hono. Its fourth principal part, its PPP is possitum. And when we look at something like facio, its fourth principal part is factum. And then for audio, its fourth principal part is auditum. Again, I use the neuter sort of ending because I like to think of my fourth principal part, in addition to being a PPP, as an accusative supine of purpose. And then I also like to remind students that verbs are treated as neuter anytime that you actually use them in a sentence. So I've always just put the Your textbook, dictionaries, or any other sort of notes that you may have received on this may have put a US on them to remind folks that it's as a PPP, it operates like an adjective and therefore can have masculine, feminine, or neuter endings. I just like to default to the to try and remind students that it can be neuter or that it is. So to each of these fourth principal parts, these PPPs, we are going to add just a simple old essay. Essay, that's all we have to do. Leaving a space in between them, not combining them. Essay. Every single time. And so for the translation, we sum essay, to have been seen. Positum essay, to have been put, or to have been placed. Factum essay, to have been made. And then auditum essay, to have been heard. Pretty straightforward and out of context. When it's in context, especially if you're looking at a Latin text where they're leaving out the essay, it's a little harder to see it. There's one thing I would be remiss if I did not mention. When we're using indirect discourse, this can sometimes change. If we are looking at something that is accusative and feminine and plural, so like the girls thought that they had not been seen, then we are going to end up having this change to a different sort of ending. We'll see a few of those, and hopefully I'll bring attention to those enough when we see them in text that you'll be okay with that sort of a change. The great thing is it helps you clarify any sort of subject, and as you've seen, sometimes Caesar gets a little vague with exactly who it is because he's using pronouns that make perfect sense to him. In English, we sometimes don't hear all that difference. All right, there's one more type of infinitive, and it's one that we have actually seen a few times in class, and that is, of course, if I had another color marker I could use, I'll have to go with green again, the future. And we are only going to look at the future active. Technically, there's a future passive, and if you are a curtamen player and you want to be that hardcore grammarian curtamen playing kid, then yes, go ahead and learn your future passive. It will come up in a curtamen round at some point before the year is over, I assure you. Will it come up in text that we see anywhere? No, not at once. But the future active infinitive is actually great because it's got that you are that we always are going around being like future, always trying to emphasize that. So if we have a verb amo, and we think about our fourth principal part, not put a comma there, but amatum, what we're going to do, just like we did with our participle, for this is we are going to insert the letters UR right there. So we'll end up with amaturum. And to that, we just add essay as its own separate word again. And to translate this, you ready for some very, very clumsy, awkward English? To be about to love. If I can be Southern again, to be fixin' to love. This is so clumsy and awkward in English that students hate it and they feel very awkward when they have to say it. And yes, out of context, it is clumsy and makes our language sound ridiculous. But for a Roman, it would make sense if you are in indirect discourse or indirect speech, and like she said that she is about to be loved by this guy, or that she will be loved by this guy. So once it's in context, we can get rid of this very awkward to be about to and just use the word will. Outside of context, it's good to think about it as always having this sort of structure, because it reminds you that we've got this future participle, which is translated the to be about to. So for any verb, any conjugation, you can do this, so long as you've got that last principal part. So again, let's look at, habeos. Fourth principal part is habitum, and mitos. Fourth principal part is, of course, misum, with two S's as opposed to the one in its perfect stem. When we have something like, let's go with copios, last principal part is captum. And then let's go scio. It's a little awkward, but we can do it in Latin. Scitum is its last principal part. They look like both a U and an M. So for these, we're just going to put in that UR. So I'm going to erase this and just add to it my habiturum for every single one of them. Missurum. Here's a fun one. Capturum. So now we see obviously where we get the English word capture. And scio becomes sciturum. And to each of these, as its own separate word, we just add our essay. And again, misurum, essay. Capturum, essay. And sciturum, essay. And for the awkward translation, we would have to be, about to be, had or held. To be, about to be sent. To be, about to be captured. Sorry, I'm making all this passive. Let me go back over that. To be about to hold. To be about to send. So Caesar, to be about to send his men out there, or was thinking that he was about to send his men out there. Capturum esse, to be about to capture. So the Greeks, about to capture Troy would be the participial sort of thing, but like the Greeks knew that they were about to capture Troy. They were fixing to capture it. And sciturum esse, to be about to know. So those are our basic infinitive sort of forms. We'll be seeing them and highlighting them more and more as we look at text and context with them. We need to look at just one last thing with this, and that's deponent verbs and their infinitives. They can have 3 of these. So if we go back to present, we can't call it active or passive. We have to call it present deponent. And for that, it's just, again, the second principal part. So if you've got for fieri, that, of course, is just to speak. And if you've got polikeor, why did I choose such a long one? Polikeri, to promise. If we've got something like sequor, go with a nice short one this time. Sequor, sequi, just to follow. And if we have morior, mori. That mori, that infinitive is just to die. And if we have something like moleri, that moleri is just to build. And so this is actually one of those places where you get to see what, for a normal verb, would be the passive, present passive infinitive. We get to see it very clearly just as its present deponent infinitive. So again, we have I's at the end of all of them. And that's probably actually the most tricky thing, the trickiest thing about this is that having an I at the end of it does not make it different from so many other words. It looks like a first person singular perfect active indicative. It looks like a genitive singular second declension noun, nominative plural or vocative plural, second declension masculine sort of noun. It looks dative singular for our third conjugation, third declension nouns. It looks like so many other things with that I ending. But if you see that R in front of it, or if you've just actually studied your vocab and you know your deponent verbs, which it seems like y'all are getting a pretty good handle on them right now, then it's pretty easy to recognize these. In addition to having present, our deponents can also have perfect infinitives. It's following me there. So for a perfect infinitive, we went to our third principal part and used it as our stem. Same thing here. We're going to go to our third principal part. So we have for, fieri, factum. Factum's our third principal part, or some folks have factum sum. Again, you're just going to take that last principal part, and to that we're going to add essay. And so instead of translating this one as like to be anything, it's just going to be to have spoken. So it's got the infinitive aspect, it's got the perfect aspect, and then it's got its definition all worked in there. So if we have, let's use sequor, because that was a nice short one there. Sequor, sequi, secutum. To that, all we have to do is add essay as its own separate word. And so to translate this, instead of saying like to be followed, it's just to have followed. So it's got the infinitive aspect through the to, it's got the perfect tense through the have, and it's got its definition through the word followed. In addition to having perfect infinitives, and obviously there is no perfect passive because they're deponents, they only have passive forms but active translations, we can technically have a future. So what we do is just like with any other future, we have our for, we have our fieri, and we have that factum. In the middle of this, we're going to insert those letters UR. So we end up with faturum, and then we're going to have an essay, and to be about to say. So when someone says, I know what you are about to say, I know what you're fixing to say, you would actually be using this sort of form. This is fairly rare in Latin, but when we do see some sort of form like this, I'll make sure to point it out. The UR, though, in the middle of this should be the dead giveaway about what form this is. So those are the different forms of infinitives. For Latin 3, you'll be having to practice with this in the next few days, and AP is just a nice review so that you can make sure you see those forms. So thank you so much for looking at them, and have a good evening.